Good morning, Lucy. Thank you for joining us with Pickmaker today. We are so glad to have you and hope to have a good interaction as you share your expertise about poster making and the nitty gritty of making a good poster.
Yeah, thank you for having me on.
Yeah, thank you. Can you just give you a brief introduction about yourself, what you contribute as a graphic designer at TAO Digital, and basically your area of expertise? How long have you been in your profession, and so basically outline of your career and your expertise.
Yeah, so I've not long graduated from university at Salford here in England, doing graphic design there. And I'm now a junior content producer and graphic designer for Tau Digital here in Bolton. A lot of that entails working with clients, working on our own social media, producing posts for, again, both client and ourselves, as well as producing the content for the websites.
Nice to know. The first thing that we would like to know is what is a poster? If someone has to explain it to say a layman in layman terms, what would you say is a poster, and what are the advantages?
Yeah, so what I would say is it's a piece of promotional material, either to sort of advertise an idea, a product, an event, for the public to consume. And the advantages of it that it can be any shape or size, and with the modern technology now, it can be a digital poster, which obviously massively increases the market that you can reach. But in the more modern sense, posters are more easy to replicate and reproduce due to the nature of it. You just be printed multiple times, and they tend to speak for themselves. So you don't necessarily need the author there to tell you what it's about. The poster's there to inform you. So yeah, they're a great piece of material for promotion.
As far as you know, does it differ from culture to culture? For example, where you stay, for example, we are in India, in the US, does it differ in terms of how it's used, in terms as a promotional material?
I think a lot of the times they are quite similar, but I would say in more of a Western world, they are on a much, much larger scale, especially in times like New York, very Americanized, I would say. Especially with the 50s sort of revolution, graphic design revolution that happened.
When you say it's done on a big scale, what do you exactly mean?
So I always think the modern poster obviously is now digital, but if you think about Times Square and like New York with the massive reproduction of posters across billboards, it's just this huge advertising platform now for the biggest brands.
On a fundamental level, what is a good poster? What makes a poster, you would say, is something that catches the eye, something that delivers results that you are aiming for? What would you say, what constitutes a good poster?
Yeah, so I would say making sure it is informative is key. Your poster has to have some sort of purpose, and I think it's important to push that so the audience know that, what is the poster there for? Your poster has to have some kind of meaning behind it. And then hand in hand with that, it has to have an eye-catching design that works to effectively show this information. And it's important to be aesthetically pleasing, but to also show the information in more than just a pretty way. But again, alongside that comes the use of type and white space, all things necessary in a good post design, It all comes together to help the viewer understand the purpose.
Now, for example, you take us as Pickmaker, and tomorrow we want to do a poster advertisement. What would you say we should, how should we plan it basically?
Yeah, so I would consider who the target market is and who the audience is. And then you can move forward in which way you want to present the poster, whether that be digital or printed. And then again, from that, consider the space. So a way in which a poster would work in person is not the same as a way in which a poster would work online. You want to consider what the information is going to be on it. And then again, from there, you can look at the finer details, the colour, the type, all of that.
Now, when you say digital or the non-digital one, what are the basic differences? Are there, large differences, big differences in the way they are designed, printed, or the way they are planned itself? Are there any big differences that you would say happen?
Yeah, so with the digital posters, I would say there tends to be less detail on it because there may be links to somewhere else, or maybe like follow this to go to this page. Whereas in person, when you're viewing a poster, everything needs to be there for you to understand what's happening.
What are the standard sizes for a printed poster?
So typically I would say A3 works best, but then in public spaces, again with billboards, massive poster boards, you can go much bigger.
Okay. In your experience, are there any principles in terms of the size of a poster? Would you say there are certain principles that brands can follow? For example, you say A3, but there may be other sizes as well, such as A4, A2.
I would say be cautious of where you're putting it, where the space is, where it's hanging. Obviously, a massive poster isn't going to fit in your tiny workspace.
Yes.
So just be always aware of where it's going to hang.
And going forward, what would you say are some things that you can't compromise on with a poster design?
Legibility is key, obviously. The audience doesn't want to work hard to understand what the poster's conveying. It's important that they can also comprehend what's presented to them. And again, hand in hand with that goes a sense of hierarchy. You don't want to work hard to look at what the title is or where the image is. So it's important to balance these and put your most important and work the sort of lesser details at the bottom of the hierarchy.
Now, from a designer's perspective, can you give us a basic understanding of how would you go about this? For example, hierarchy, legibility. How would you go about this process?
Yeah, so I always start by listing what components are going onto the poster. So title, image, text, and so on. And then from that list, I'll create it without any background or anything. And then from there, I'll produce the backgrounds, the colours, the patterns, so on and so on, and work with that to try and make it as legible, but as fun and as visually appealing as possible.
What are you, as a designer, graphic designer yourself, you'd probably have a list of posters that you like, that you admire. So can you give us probably 2 or 3 of your favorite posters?
For me, I'm always drawn to the posters which have a bit of a call to action about them. So much of that comes from quite a lot of 80s designs with the crises that were going on. And one of them is the Silence Equals Death poster, which was produced by a group of gay activists in New York during the AIDS crisis. And the poster is so prominent during that period. It's such a political stance against what was happening. And it uses such a stark and serious tone to really convey the seriousness of the subject matter. And it's extremely effective just using a simple triangle image and a bit of type at the bottom. It's not necessarily the most aesthetically pleasing to look at, but it is a very important image and it does catch your attention. And then from that, Keith Haring later developed it later on in the 80s. Obviously, he was a massive AIDS activist, but he pushed more of a, I guess, cartoonized in his style, where he produced characters on it, kind of reflecting the American government at the time, with the 3 characters, the deaf, the blind and the dumb. So yeah, it's a really important piece of art during that period.
Okay, so those 2 are the posters that stand out for you.
Yeah.
So just digging a little deep into that, when we speak of art, we say there is some science involved, there is some there is more than just art to it, right? So in terms of poster, would you say it's art, or is it science? There is science involved as well?
I would say it does mix the two. I think it's important to somewhat not always be serious about it. And while Keith Haring did have a serious message behind it, his artwork still remained in his quirky little character styles, but it still held that very serious message.
Okay, so you'd say it's a mix of art and science as well. Yes.
Yeah.
Can you give us so probably a handful of principles that you follow as a designer when it comes to designing a poster?
Yeah, so as spoken about before, legibility is always at the top of the list, I would say, alongside hierarchy. When producing posts, I'd say I do always try and bend the rules a little bit. You don't always have to fully stick to it, but as long as it functions, it's fine. And colour contrast is something that I also like to really think about too, whether that be on the actual poster or on the space it's going to hang. It's important to think about how will it stand out and how will it grab someone's attention. And then consistency throughout the design is very important too. It has to be balanced and it has to work in a way where you can comprehend each aspect differently. And that can include like just using grids in your practice until you fully understand where the balance is on the page.
Yeah, just picking up from what you said, do you by any chance put yourself in the shoes of a viewer and try to understand how they might view a poster, or is it just your own way of designing it and you let the viewer decide for themselves?
No, I think it's very important to sort of see how a viewer would see it. It's always important to even just print out a rough design, hang it up, take a step back and look at it, or even get a non-designer's opinion, because at the end of the day that's essentially who you're designing for, a non-designer. So it's always useful to look through the eyes of a non-designer.
Since you say that is important, do you gather feedback through the design process, or do you do that on a post-production level, or when do you do that, looking through the eyes of the viewer?
I would say once I've got to somewhat of a final design, that's when I would go for feedback. And then from that feedback, you can make your small refinements to move on.
Can you give us a sequence of steps that you follow in terms of designing a poster?
Yeah, so I always start by, again, listing all my components, putting them in the most important order, whether that be like the title, the imagery, the finer details. And then I would typically sketch out a few concepts, a few ideas, which I can then develop in InDesign or whatever software I'm using. And then typically decide on your typefaces, maybe about 1 to 3, depending on what the poster is, what's it conveying. And then again, your colour palette, consider where it's going to hang. And then that's at the point, once you've got that design, think about getting the feedback and then producing the refinements.
So when someone comes to you with a requirement for designing a poster, what sort of details do you gather from them?
So say if it was for an event, I would ask for the title, the time, the venue, any extra details such as websites, where to buy tickets. And then I would sort of gather information from them, such as if they wanted any imagery, if they wanted specific colours, just to get the full details that they want.
When we say event posters, are there any fixed ways of going about it? For example, as you said, should it only be a typography-based poster, or should it be a graphic-based poster? So how do you decide on that? Apart from, of course, the person telling you the way they want it.
I think one thing to consider is obviously the audience again. If your audience is going to understand completely an image-based poster with just a tiny bit of type, then yeah, go for it. But if it's something that requires a lot more detail for them to understand, then I would go from there. It's the most important thing to consider, I would say, your audience and how that poster is going to be presented to them.
But is there anything specific that you try to do with your design based on the type of poster that you are being asked to design? For example, if it's a typography-based poster, is there anything specific that you sort of try to implement with a typography-based poster rather than, say, if it's a graphic poster?
I would honestly say to this, no. I like to experiment with my poster designs. Obviously, if you follow the steps to get the legibility, the hierarchy, follow the grids, I don't think there's too much pressure on creating a perfect typographic poster. Don't traditionally follow any steps.
And just a little bit more on that, would you say, are there anything that, in terms of your, the people who are asking you to design, do you go back to them to ask for any other details during the design process? Or is it just you ask them at the start and then you start going?
So at the point of where I think things maybe need refined, go back to the client or whoever you design it for, and And at that point, I'd say, do you like the design, blah, blah, blah. And is there any component that you think I've missed off or that you now want to include? I think that step of feedback's always important.
As you have said, when you are looking at a poster, you look for hierarchy, you look for legibility and alignment and so on and so forth. But when you are looking at a poster, if you're putting yourself in the shoes of a viewer, how do you judge a poster? What do you say when you are looking out for a poster design that catches your eye? What aspects are you looking for? What aspects are you picking up on?
Yeah, so I would always consider its ability to stand alone. You shouldn't have to have a verbal explanation about your poster. It should be able to just hang on a wall and everyone can go, yeah, that's what that's about, I know that. And again, with the design sort of aspect of it, it shouldn't be cluttered to stand alone on the wall, and the appropriate colours, fonts, which match the subject matter at hand and sort of target your audience. And all this visual appeal will help your poster go back to the original point of standing alone.
Just going a little deeper in that point that you made, what would you say, as a designer, how do you judge a poster success? I mean, there is of course feedback and other aspects to it, but as a designer, how do you say this poster, this one was my work of art and it was successful? How do you gauge that?
I think by sort of the general opinion of it does help. If you get other designers saying this is functional, this works, this is beautiful, then it's always a success. But I think getting the non-designer eye to go, this works for me, I understand it, is one of the most important ways to judge the success of your work.
And when you say, when there are designers giving you feedback, that's when you truly understand the success of your poster. Do you have any poster designers or art directors whom you look up to and whom you sort of gather feedback from?
I would say, but always thinking back to my university days when obviously my lecturers, my tutors were graphic designers, it was also always really helpful to have their input. They've had like years and years of experience and have worked on big projects. Anywhere you can find a designer's help. You don't have to just always consider the big game changers in graphic design. Yeah.
Well, so in terms of your own work and your basically your stream of work, what inspired you to get into graphic design, designing posters, and basically this line of work? What inspired you to this?
So I've the creative side of promoting, marketing, things like that. And for me, it was considering ways in which I could produce work that helped people, sort of relating back to the First Things First manifesto. It's important to produce work that has meaning and helps the modern consumer beyond just looking pretty. So producing posters that have political meaning, have environmental meaning, has always been very important to me.
Now we are in the age of we are in the digital age where everything that you come across, where everything you see is digital. So, and posters are primarily a print form of advertising. So how relevant are they in today's digital age?
Yeah, I still think they are very relevant. They have managed to adapt in a way which we consume them differently via social media, but actual printed posters still hold a lot of relevance, I think. There's studies that show the way in which we perceive things in person on print compared to digitally, showing that we absorb the information much better when we read it in person. So it acts as, a great marketing tool, a great advertising tool for those bigger billboards potentially. But digital posters have become in a way used on things like Instagram stories or Twitter posts, where we can just passively read it, click a link, and we're there at the information we need. So I think they are still very important in an environmental sense, but there's definitely the adaptation for the digital sense.
So would you say we are, as marketers and as advertisers, we are using posters differently to appeal to the modern consumer? Would you say that?
Yeah, definitely. We spend a lot of our lives online, and it becomes an important way to catch the consumer's eye. So you have to sort of keep up with how the consumer absorbs new information.
So just give us a bit of perspective into, for example, from where you are, how are posters employed as an advertising tool? Can you just give us a brief perspective about how are they used and how effective they are?
Yeah, so within my job, we sort of use them across Twitter and Instagram mainly. It's not necessarily your traditional sense of a poster, but it's just needed, and then encouraging the consumer of it to look further on their own rather than producing all the information at once. And this helps with marketing strategies, again, getting links, getting clicks, getting higher Google views altogether.
Taking it from there, what would you say are the mistakes that you would want to avoid when designing posters?
In terms of like physical print, you would want to check your size and style of it. It needs to be appropriate for printing, and this can include the actual design process. Like, you don't want type or images to look too big on the page, and at the same time you don't want it to look too small. You need to ensure it's suitable for the space it's going to hang in as well. And again, on the design element of it, you need to ensure that the colours are correct, whether you're working in RGB, CY, CMYK. Otherwise, when you print it, it's going to look dull. It's not going to look as nice as you want it to be. Make sure you work in the right DPI, and you always export it in the right DPI. You don't want to spend all your time working on this beautiful poster and you go to get it printed and you have like 500 copies of this pixelated piece. So I think always in the refinement stages, that's when you need to figure out what's working and what's not.
So you talked about DPI. Do you have a specific number which you want to not go beyond that, or do you have a number?
So typically for print, I would always go for 300 DPI. You just get the best quality out of it.
And in your own experience, in your career, would you say I have made a few mistakes, but I've learned from them in terms of designing posters?
You start designing posters, you understand graphic design rules to it, but it's only through producing and getting the feedback from it, then you can learn. I mean, at the start, when I started making, I would say there wasn't much hierarchy sense at all, but it's just learning from that and developing your own skills.
So would you say every designer has their own style element to designing a poster? Apart from the general principles, does every designer have their own way of designing it? Does their own identity come into it?
I've never sort of known two designers to sort of work in the same way. I think it's interesting how different designers will always take up different techniques, whether that's choosing the fonts, choosing the colours. It's just sort of finding what fits best for you and is going to get you the best result possible.
Okay. Now we're just going back to the printing aspect of posters that you touched on. What would you say are the best practices?
Yeah, I would say if you're going to print it yourself, it becomes much easier to learn about the printer you're using, the paper you want to use, things like that. But if you're going to print through a company, you want to do your research into the company that you're using. Be wary of what paper they are using and what kind of printers they use to get the best result. It can become costly, so you don't want to waste all your money on a company which ruins your posters.
Are there any other things that you would say needs to be looked at when we are proceeding with printing a poster?
Again, it would just go back to sort of the paper quality and things like that. Obviously, if it's going to hang in an environmental space outside, you need to consider the ways in which things may affect the poster and how it'll hang, like a space that's got bright lighting, for example, considered to a space which is quite dull. You might want to consider as well the colours that are going to affect the way in which the lighting hits it.
So thank you, Lucy. Thank you for sharing your expertise and the tips that you followed and everything about making a poster. I'm sure this is going to be of use to a lot of audience of PicMaker, and it's going to help a lot of people in designing posters going forward as well. So thank you for joining us, and I'm sure this interview will go a long way towards helping people out there.
Great, thank you so much.
Thank you.